In the harsh plains of Montana, 1885, Eleanor Blackwood stood at the train station, her heart pounding as she clutched a worn photograph in her trembling hands. 6 times she had made this journey, 6 times she had been sent back. As her fingers traced the scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, she wondered if the 7th time would be different. What Eleanor didn't know was that the man waiting for her, Cattle Baron Jackson Taylor, hadn't seen a face in 15 years and never would again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whistle of the approaching train echoed across the open prairie, stirring Eleanor from her thoughts. Steam billowed around the platform of Blackwater Station, Montana, as she smoothed down her best dress, the only one that hadn't frayed at the edges after months of careful mending. 26 years old and considered damaged goods back in Boston, Eleanor had responded to a newspaper advertisement 6 months ago, seeking brides for frontier gentlemen of means and character. Her family had been relieved to see her go. Ever since the fire that claimed their home when she was 16, leaving her with the vivid scar that twisted down the left side of her face, they had treated her like a burden. Her once promising future as a teacher's apprentice had vanished along with her unblemished appearance. In a society that valued a woman's beauty above all else, Eleanor had become invisible, except when she was the subject of pity or revulsion. Last. "Call for Blackwater!" the conductor shouted, his voice carrying over the din of the station. Eleanor gathered her single valise, all that remained of her possessions after 6 failed matches, and stepped onto the train. She had learned to request a seat facing away from other passengers, sparing them the shock of seeing her scarred profile. As the locomotive lurched forward, she pulled out the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago. "Miss Blackwood, I understand you are seeking a match on the frontier. My name is Jackson Taylor. I own the Double T Ranch, 20 miles outside Blackwater, Montana. 5,000 acres, 300 head of cattle, and more loneliness than any man should bear. I am 38, widowed these past 5 years, and in need of a wife to help manage my household and business affairs. You should know that I lost my sight in a ranch accident 15 years ago. My foreman tells me this makes me an unsuitable match for most women. Perhaps it makes me a suitable match for someone who has also faced difficulties in finding connection. If you are interested, passage will be arranged. Respectfully, Jackson." Taylor Eleanor had read the letter so many times, the creases were starting to tear. A blind man. Her previous matches had all ended the same way. The moment the men saw her face, their expressions shifted from hope to disappointment. Some had been cruel about it, others awkwardly polite before arranging her return journey east. But a man who couldn't see her face, it seemed almost too convenient, as if fate were finally offering her a cruel joke rather than a real chance. The train journey took 3 days. Eleanor spent most of it staring out the window, watching as the crowded eastern cities gave way to the vast expanses of the west. Each mile brought her closer to either another rejection or something she hardly dared to hope for: acceptance. Blackwater was barely more than a cluster of wooden buildings when the train finally pulled into the station. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Eleanor stepped onto the platform, her legs stiff from the journey. The station was empty except for a tall man with a weathered face leaning against a post. "Miss Blackwood," he called, pushing himself upright. Eleanor nodded, clutching her valise tighter. "Name's Caleb Morris, foreman at the Double T." He tipped his hat. "Mr. Taylor sent me to fetch you." His eyes flickered to her scar for just a moment before returning, to meet her gaze, his expression unchanged. "Thank you, Mr. Morris," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. He led her to a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch," he explained as he helped her climb up to the seat. Mr. Taylor would have come himself, but he paused, arranging her valise in the back of the wagon. But he's blind, Eleanor finished for him. He mentioned it in his letter. Caleb nodded, climbing up beside her. Been that way since a cattle stampede caught him off guard. Bull gored him, knocked him into a ravine. Doctor said the blow to his head damaged something that couldn't be fixed. He flicked the reins, and the horses began to move. Changed him, that accident. Not just blindness. Made him more thoughtful in a way. Less rash than he was as a young man. They rode in silence. For a while, the wagon jostling over the uneven terrain. The landscape was different from anything Eleanor had seen before. Vast stretches of grassland, interrupted by rocky outcroppings and distant mountains. "It's beautiful here," she said finally. "Different kind of beauty than back east, I expect," Caleb replied. "Takes some getting used to." "I'm good at adapting," Eleanor said quietly. Caleb glanced at her. "Mr. Taylor said you'd been matched before." Eleanor's fingers instinctively rose to her scar. 6 times. "People can be cruel about things that don't matter much in the grand scheme," Caleb said, his eyes back on the road. "And what about Mr. Taylor?" Eleanor asked. "What should I know about him that wasn't in his letter?" Caleb considered this for a moment. "He's fair. Expects hard work but gives the same in return. Doesn't tolerate dishonesty. Stubborn as a mule. Sometimes," a small smile crossed his face, "but loyal to those who earn it. Best boss I've ever had." "Is he—" Eleanor hesitated. "Is he a kind man?" "Kind enough," Caleb answered. "Not one for flowery words or grand gestures, but he's never turned away someone in need, and he treats his people well." He paused. His wife, Sarah, died of fever 5 years back. They were childhood sweethearts. Hit him hard, losing her, especially not being able to see her face at the end. Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy. No children? They tried. Wasn't meant to be. Caleb adjusted his hat. Ranch keeps him busy, but a place that size needs more than one person to run it properly. He's got his pride, though. Took him 3 years after Sarah passed to admit he needed help, and another 2 to consider remarrying. As they crested a hill, a sprawling ranch came into view. A large 2-story house stood at its center, surrounded by barns, corrals, and smaller outbuildings. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and in the distance, several riders moved among the herds. "Welcome to the Double T," Caleb said, gesturing toward the vista. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. This was it, her 7th chance at a new life. The wagon rolled into the ranch yard, and several workers paused to watch their arrival. Eleanor felt their curious gazes and resisted the urge to turn her scarred side away. She'd spent too many years hiding. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop in front of the main house. "Wait here," he said, jumping down. "I'll let Mr. Taylor know we've arrived." Eleanor remained seated, taking in the details of what might become her home. The house was well maintained, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Flower beds, surprisingly lush for the harsh environment, lined the walkway. The front door opened, and Caleb emerged, followed by a tall man with broad shoulders. Jackson Taylor moved with surprising confidence for someone who couldn't see, one hand lightly touching the porch railing as he descended the steps. He was handsome in a rugged way, with dark hair streaked with grey at the temples and a strong jawline covered by a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, a pale blue, stared ahead without focus. Caleb helped Eleanor down from the wagon. Her legs felt unsteady as she approached the man who might become her husband. "Miss Blackwood," Jackson said, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "Welcome to Double T." Eleanor stopped a few feet away from him. "Mr. Taylor, thank you for the invitation." A slight smile curved his lips. "You have a lovely voice. Eastern, but not Boston. Philadelphia." "Close," Eleanor replied, surprised. "I grew up outside Philadelphia, but I've lived in Boston these past 8 years." Jackson nodded. I've developed an ear for such things. He gestured toward the house. You must be tired after your journey. Please come inside. Mrs. Finch, my housekeeper, has prepared refreshments. He turned and moved confidently back up the steps. Eleanor followed, noting how he navigated without hesitation, his hand occasionally brushing against objects as if confirming their position rather than discovering them. The interior of the house was spacious and well-appointed, though simpler than the homes Eleanor had known back east. Practical furniture, sturdy and comfortable rather than ornate, filled the rooms. Large windows allow natural light to flood the space. Mrs. Finch, Jackson called as they entered a comfortable sitting room. Our guest has arrived. A plump woman with grey hair pulled into a tight bun emerged from what Eleanor assumed was the kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron and offered a small curtsy. Miss Blackwood, welcome, she said, her eyes taking in Eleanor's appearance with a quick, assessing glance that lingered briefly on her scar before moving on. I've prepared some tea and sandwiches. You must be famished after such a long journey. Thank you, Mrs. Finch, Eleanor replied. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Please sit, Jackson said, gesturing toward a nearby chair. He found his own seat with practiced ease. Mrs. Finch, would you give us some privacy after you've brought the refreshments? The housekeeper nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. An awkward silence fell between them. Eleanor studied Jackson's face, trying to read his expression. Without the ability to make eye contact, she found it difficult to gauge his thoughts. I imagine you have questions, Jackson said finally. As do you, I'm sure, Eleanor replied. He smiled, a genuine expression that softened his features. Direct. I appreciate that. He leaned forward slightly. I should be clear about my expectations, Miss Blackwood. I'm offering a marriage of convenience. I need someone to help manage the household, to be my eyes in business matters, and to provide companionship. In return, I offer financial security, a good home, and my respect. And if it doesn't work between us? Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite her nerves. Then I will ensure you have the means to establish yourself elsewhere, Jackson answered, without hesitation. I won't keep anyone here against their will. Mrs. Finch returned with a tray, setting it on the table between them before quietly excusing herself. Eleanor poured the tea, placing a cup in Jackson's hand when he extended it. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she noticed a slight tensing of his shoulders. Tell me about yourself, he said after taking a sip. Your letter was rather brief. Eleanor hesitated. Should she mention her scar immediately, or wait for him to ask why she had been rejected 6 times? I was a teacher's apprentice. In Boston, she began. Before that, I grew up on a small farm outside Philadelphia. My parents and younger brother still live there. What made you answer an advertisement for frontier brides? Jackson asked. The direct question caught her off guard. I wanted a fresh start. Jackson's expression remained neutral. Most women who come west as brides are running from something or toward something. Sometimes both. Eleanor took a deep breath. When I was 16, there was a fire at our farm. I was trapped inside the house before my father could reach me. Her hand rose unconsciously to her face. I survived, but I was left with a scar that runs from my temple to my jaw on the left side of my face. Jackson's expression didn't change. I see. That's why I've been rejected by 6 potential husbands, she continued, her voice growing stronger. They all found my appearance disappointing. Jackson set down his teacup. Their loss, then. The simple statement, delivered without pity or false sentiment, made Eleanor's throat tighten unexpectedly. My blindness has taught me that what we think matters often doesn't, Jackson continued. I can't see your scar, it's true, but I wouldn't care about it even if I could." "You can't know that," Eleanor said softly. "Perhaps not," he acknowledged, "but I know that character reveals itself in actions, not appearances." He paused. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Blackwood?" Eleanor tensed. "Yes. Are you afraid of hard work? This ranch demands much from everyone who lives here." The question surprised her. "No, Mr. Taylor. I'm not afraid of hard work. Do you speak your mind, or do you hide your thoughts? I've learned to be cautious with my opinions," she admitted, "but I value honesty." Jackson nodded slowly. "Final question. Why should I choose you as my wife when there are dozens of women who would accept a proposal from a wealthy rancher, blind or not?" The bluntness of the question made Eleanor pause. She considered giving a placating answer, something designed to please him, but something in his straightforward manner made her decide on honesty instead. "Because I won't stay with you out of gratitude or pity," she said firmly. "If I agree to marry you, it will be a partnership. I won't be subservient because you've saved me from spinsterhood, nor will I take advantage of your blindness. I'll work alongside you, speak the truth to you, and build something worthwhile with you. Not because I have no other options, but because I choose to." Jackson was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Well said, Miss Blackwood." He stood, moving to a nearby desk with confident steps. "I have a proposition. Stay at the Double T for 2 weeks. Learn about the ranch, the people here, and decide if this is a life you could embrace. At the end of that time, we'll both make our decisions." Eleanor considered this. "That seems fair." "Excellent." Jackson rang a small bell on his desk. A moment later, Mrs. Finch appeared. "Please show Miss Blackwood to the guest room and help her get settled." As Eleanor rose to follow the housekeeper, Jackson added, "Dinner is at 6. I look forward to continuing our conversation then." That evening, Eleanor sat across from Jackson at a long dining table, with Mrs. Finch serving a meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh vegetables from the ranch's garden. The food was simple but delicious, far better than anything Eleanor had eaten on her journey west. "Tell me about your daily routine on the ranch," Eleanor said as they ate. Jackson described his work: meetings with the foreman and ranch hands, decisions about breeding and grazing, financial management, and occasional trips into town for business. "I've adapted my methods over the years," he explained. "Caleb is invaluable for the physical aspects of ranching that I can no longer manage myself, but all major decisions remain mine." "And what would my role be beyond household management?" Eleanor asked. "You would be my eyes for correspondence, contracts and accounts," Jackson replied. "Mrs. Finch handles the domestic staff, but the ranch's business affairs need attention. My previous foreman used to read documents to me, but since he retired and Caleb took over, that task has been more challenging." Eleanor nodded, forgetting momentarily that he couldn't see the gesture. "I have experience with accounts from my teaching days. I managed the school's modest budget for 2 years. "That would be useful," Jackson said, "but more than specific skills, I need someone I can trust, someone whose judgment I can rely on when my own senses fail me." The frankness of his statement struck Eleanor. Here was a man who acknowledged his limitations without shame, but also without self-pity. "May I ask about your accident?" she ventured. "Mr. Morris mentioned a cattle stampede." Jackson's face darkened slightly, his hand tightening around his fork. For a moment Eleanor thought she had overstepped, but then he sighed. 15 years ago I was young and arrogant," he began. "Thought I could handle anything the land or the cattle threw at me. A thunderstorm spooked the herd, and instead of letting my men handle it, I rode right into the thick of it." He touched his temple, where a faint scar was visible beneath his hairline. "A bull caught me with its horn, threw me into a ravine. When I woke up 3 days later, the world was dark, and it stayed that way ever since." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. "Don't be," Jackson replied. "It taught me humility and patience, lessons I sorely needed." He set down his utensils. "What about you, Miss Blackwood? What did your fire teach you?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before, what she had learned rather than what she had lost. "It taught me that people see what they expect to see," she said slowly. "Before the fire, I was the pretty farmer's daughter who was going to become a teacher. Afterward, I was the scarred girl whom everyone pitied but no one really saw." She took a sip of water. "It also taught me resilience and to value those who look beyond appearances." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "Not many get such harsh lessons so young." "We adapt or we perish," Eleanor said, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "Indeed we do." Jackson lifted his glass in a small toast. "To adapt, then." Eleanor raised her own glass, feeling a strange connection forming with this man who couldn't see her but who somehow seemed to understand her better than most. As dinner concluded, Jackson suggested a tour of the house. He led the way confidently, occasionally touching a doorframe or piece of furniture, explaining the layout and history of the ranch. The house was larger than it had appeared from outside, with 6 bedrooms, a study, a library filled with books, and several sitting rooms. "How do you navigate so well?" Eleanor asked as they entered the library. "You move as if you can see everything." "Around you," Jackson smiled. 15 years of practice, I've memorized every inch of this house. Each room has its own feel, the way sound travels, the slight differences in temperature, even the smell." He ran his fingers along a bookshelf. "I had everything arranged in a specific order after I lost my sight. Nothing gets moved without my knowledge." "And the books?" Eleanor asked, looking at the extensive collection. "Mrs. Finch reads to me sometimes," he admitted. "And I have a young ranch hand, Timothy, who reads to me 3 evenings a week in exchange for additional wages. But many of these were Sarah's, my late wife's. She loved literature." Eleanor noted the gentle way he spoke his wife's name. "You must have loved her very much." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "We grew up together. I can still picture her face perfectly, one of the blessings of having seen her for 20 years before losing my sight." He turned toward Eleanor. "Does that bother you? That I still hold her memory dear?" "No," Eleanor replied honestly. "It would concern me more if you didn't." Relief flickered across his face. "Many women would find it threatening." "I'm not many women," Eleanor said simply. The following morning, Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains of her guest room. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The unfamiliar sounds of ranch life filtering through the open window, distant cattle lowing, horses nickering in the stables, the voices of ranch hands already at work despite the early hour. She dressed in her most practical outfit, a simple blue cotton dress with a white collar, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Finch was already busy in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread and coffee filling the air. "Good morning, Miss Blackwood," the housekeeper greeted, wiping flour from her hands. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks," Eleanor admitted. The bed had been comfortable, and the quiet of the countryside a welcome change from the noise of Boston boarding houses. "Mr. Taylor rises early," Mrs. Finch explained, pouring a cup of coffee. "He's already been out with the men since dawn. Ask me to show you around once you're ready." She passed the cup to Eleanor, said you might want to see how things work here. After a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread, Eleanor followed Mrs. Finch on a tour of the ranch grounds. The main house stood at the center of a complex operation. Stables housing over 30 horses, a bunkhouse for the dozen ranch hands who worked the property, storage barns for feed and equipment, and corrals where young cattle were separated. For branding or medical attention, how does Mr. Taylor manage all this without being able to see? Eleanor wondered aloud as they watched a group of cowboys working with young calves. Mrs. Finch smiled knowingly. Don't let his blindness fool you. That man knows more about what happens on this ranch than folks with perfect vision. He can tell which horse is approaching by the sound of its gait, knows every worker's voice, and can identify cattle by their smell. She adjusted her bonnet against the morning sun. And what his other senses don't tell him, his people do. He inspires loyalty. They continued walking, the vastness of the Double T becoming increasingly apparent. 5,000 acres, Mrs. Finch said, gesturing to the distant horizons. Stretches from the creek to the north, all the way to those hills in the south. Best grazing land in the territory. And he built all this himself? Eleanor asked. Started. With 500 acres and 50 head of cattle when he was 20, the housekeeper confirmed. Built it into one of the largest operations in Montana. Even after the accident, he kept expanding. Some say he became more determined, like he had something to prove. As they rounded a large barn, Eleanor spotted Jackson in a nearby corral, with Caleb and 2 other ranch hands. Even from a distance, his commanding presence was evident. He stood straight-backed beside a magnificent black stallion, one hand on the animal's neck, listening intently as Caleb spoke. "That's Midnight," Mrs. Finch explained, following Eleanor's gaze. "Mr. Taylor's horse, only one he trusts to ride even now." "He still rides." Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. "Only with Caleb or Timothy alongside, and only on familiar trails," the housekeeper said. "But yes, says a rancher who can't sit a horse isn't a rancher at all." As they approached, Jackson's head turned slightly in their direction. Eleanor marveled at how he seemed to sense their presence before any of the others. "Noticed. Miss Blackwood," he called, excusing himself from the men and walking confidently toward the fence. "I trust Mrs. Finch is giving you the full tour." "She is," Eleanor replied, impressed again by how he navigated without assistance, stopping just short of the fence between them. "Your operation is impressive, Mr. Taylor." A small smile touched his lips. "Would you like to see more? I was about to ride the north pasture with Caleb to check on a new herd we brought in last week." The invitation surprised her. "I'm not much of a rider," she admitted. "Timothy can saddle our gentlest mare," Jackson offered. "She'll follow Midnight without any guidance, unless you'd prefer to stay at home." There was a subtle challenge in his voice, as if testing whether she truly meant what she'd said about not being afraid of hard work. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "I'd be delighted to join you," she said firmly. 20 minutes later, Eleanor found herself atop a chestnut mare named Maple, riding alongside Jackson while Caleb led the way. Timothy, a boy of perhaps 16 with freckles scattered across his face, rode behind them. "Maple knows the trails better than most of the hands," Jackson explained as they set out. "Just relax and let her follow." Eleanor gripped the saddle, horned tightly at first, but as they settled into a comfortable pace, she began to enjoy the experience. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. Around them, the landscape unfolded in a tapestry of rolling hills, green pastures and distant mountains. "Beautiful country," Jackson commented, as if reading her thoughts. "It is," Eleanor agreed. "How do you know?" "I can feel the sun on my face, smell the grass and sage, hear how sound travels across open spaces." He turned his face toward her, the breeze ruffling his dark hair. "Just because I can't see it doesn't mean I don't experience it." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves creating a soothing backdrop. Ahead, Caleb pointed out features of the land, the creek that provided water for the eastern pastures, the line of trees marking the property boundary, the subtle changes in vegetation that indicated different soil conditions. "Mr. Taylor has the whole ranch mapped in his head," Timothy explained proudly as he rode up beside Eleanor. "He can tell exactly where we are, just by the sounds and smells." "Enough, Timothy," Jackson called from ahead, his tone light but firm. "Miss Blackwood will think I have supernatural abilities if you continue." "Sorry, sir," the boy replied, not looking sorry at all as he winked at Eleanor. After an hour's ride, they crested a hill to find a herd of cattle grazing in the valley below. Caleb explained that these were new breeding stock brought in from Texas to strengthen the herd's bloodlines. "Prime animals," Jackson said with satisfaction after Caleb described their condition. The investment was worth it. Eleanor watched as he engaged with Caleb in a detailed discussion about grazing rotations, breeding schedules, and market projections. Despite his blindness, Jackson's grasp of the operation was comprehensive. He asked incisive questions, made quick decisions, and clearly understood every aspect of the business. As they prepared to return to the ranch house, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. "Storm coming," Caleb observed. "We should head back." They increased their pace, but the weather moved faster. Halfway back, fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Maple grew skittish beneath Eleanor. "Stay calm," Jackson called over the intensifying rain. "Keep a firm hand on the reins, but don't pull too hard." Eleanor tried to follow his instructions, but as lightning flashed nearby, Maple reared unexpectedly. Eleanor lost her grip and tumbled sideways, landing hard on the muddy ground. The mare bolted a short distance away. "Eleanor!" Jackson shouted, immediately sensing the commotion. Without hesitation, he dismounted, handing Midnight's reins to Caleb. "Where is she?" "I'm all right," Eleanor called, pushing herself to her feet, wincing at the pain in her ankle. "Just a bit shaken." Despite the rain and his blindness, Jackson moved unerringly in her direction, guided by her voice. When he reached her, his hands found her shoulders with surprising accuracy. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his face tight with concern. "My ankle," she admitted. "I don't think it's broken, just twisted." Without warning, he bent and swept her into his arms. "Caleb," he called, "catch Maple and lead her back. Timothy, stay close to me." "Mr. Taylor, this isn't necessary," Eleanor protested, acutely aware of his strength as he carried her toward Midnight. "Jackson," he corrected, "after falling from a horse for me, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." With Timothy's help, he managed to get Eleanor safely onto Midnight's back before mounting behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, his chest solid against her back. "I won't let you fall," he promised, his voice close to her ear. "Midnight knows the way home, even in this weather." The ride back was a blur of sensation. The warmth of Jackson's body shielding her from the rain, the sure-footed movements of the powerful horse beneath them, the strange intimacy of being held by a man she barely knew, yet somehow trusted. By the time they reached the ranch, the storm had passed, leaving everything dripping and fresh. Jackson carried Eleanor directly into the house despite her protests that she could walk. "Mrs. Finch," he called as they entered. "Miss Blackwood has had a fall. Her ankle needs attention." The housekeeper appeared immediately, clucking with concern as Jackson carefully set Eleanor down on a settee in the parlor. Mrs. Finch examined the injury with gentle but knowing hands. "Just a sprain," she pronounced. "I'll wrap it and make a poultice. She'll need to stay off it for a day or two." Jackson stood nearby, water dripping from his clothes onto the polished floor. His expression was uncharacteristically vulnerable. The usual composure replaced by evident worry. "I should not have suggested the ride," he said, running a hand through his wet hair. "It was thoughtless of me." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied firmly. "I chose to go. And besides, a little rain and a twisted ankle are hardly life-threatening conditions." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're not one for self-pity, are you, Eleanor?" "No more than you are," she returned, surprised by how natural it felt to use his given name. Mrs. Finch returned with bandages and a pungent-smelling herbal mixture. As she worked on Eleanor's ankle, she shooed Jackson away. "Go change before you catch your death, Mr. Taylor. Miss Blackwood is in good hands." That evening, Eleanor found herself installed in the library, her bandaged foot propped on a cushioned stool. Jackson had insisted she take the most comfortable chair, positioned near the fireplace, where a gentle blaze kept the night's chill at bay. Mrs. Finch had brought dinner on trays, allowing Eleanor to rest rather than making her way to the dining room. "The poultice seems to be working," Eleanor observed, as Jackson settled in a chair opposite her. "The swelling has gone down considerably." "Mrs. Finch's grandmother was a healer," Jackson explained. "She knows more about folk remedies than any doctor I've met." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I truly am sorry about today." "Please, stop apologizing," Eleanor said gently. "In fact, despite the dramatic conclusion, I enjoyed our ride immensely, did you?" Genuine pleasure warmed his voice. "I did," she confirmed. "It gave me a better understanding of the ranch, and of you." "What do you mean?" Eleanor considered her words carefully. "You're different out there. More free, somehow. As if the limitations you face elsewhere matter less when you're on horseback, on your own land." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "That's remarkably perceptive," he said finally. "The ranch is where I feel most like myself. Out there, blindness becomes just another challenge to navigate, not a defining characteristic." "Like a scar," Eleanor murmured. "Exactly." Jackson's unseeing eyes seemed to find her, an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. "We are more than our scars, Eleanor, more than what others see or don't see when they look at us." The simple truth of his statement resonated deeply. For so long, Eleanor had allowed herself to be defined by her disfigurement, accepting the labels and limitations others placed on her. Sitting there in the warm library of Double T Ranch, she suddenly felt the possibility of a different kind of existence, one where her scar was just a part of her story, not its conclusion. "Tell me more about your teaching," Jackson requested, changing the subject as if sensing her emotional response. "What did you teach? What did you enjoy about it?" Eleanor welcomed the shift. "I taught younger children primarily. Reading, writing, basic arithmetic. What I loved most was watching them discover their own capabilities. There's something magical about the moment when a child realizes they can read on their own or solve a problem they couldn't before." They talked long into the evening. Jackson spoke of his early years building the ranch, the challenges and triumphs, the lessons learned through trial and error. Eleanor shared stories of her students, her life in Boston, her dreams of someday opening a small school of her own. As the fire burned low, a comfortable silence fell between them. Eleanor realized with surprise that hours had passed in conversation, that had flowed naturally, without awkwardness or strain. "It's getting late," Jackson said eventually, rising from his chair. "You should rest your ankle." Eleanor nodded, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. "Yes, I suppose I should." He moved to her side, offering his arm. "May I escort you to your room?" With his support, Eleanor managed the stairs without putting too much weight on her injured ankle. At her door, Jackson paused. "Thank you for today," he said softly. "For your company, your conversation, and for not treating my blindness as something to be pitied or feared." "Thank you for the same," Eleanor replied, her hand unconsciously touching her scarred cheek. As if sensing her movement, Jackson raised his hand slowly. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Understanding his intention, Eleanor took his hand and guided it to her face. His fingers were warm and calloused as they gently traced the contours of her features, pausing at the raised line of her scar. Unlike the revulsion she had seen in the eyes of others, his touch held only curiosity and acceptance. "Beautiful," he murmured, his thumb brushing lightly over her cheekbone. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest. No one had called her beautiful since the fire. "You can't even see me," she said, her voice catching. "I see you more clearly than most," Jackson replied, lowering his hand. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Jackson," she whispered as he turned and made his way back toward the stairs, his steps confident even in the dimly lit hallway. That night, Eleanor lay awake, replaying the day's events in her mind. 1 week ago, she had been on yet another train, heading west with dwindling hope and resources, expecting rejection once again. Now she found herself in a place that already felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since the fire. And Jackson Taylor, he was unlike any man she had ever known. The next morning, Eleanor's ankle felt markedly improved, though Mrs. Finch insisted she continue to rest it. She spent the day in the ranch office adjacent to the library, where Jackson asked her to organize some correspondence and accounts that had been neglected. "My previous system worked well enough when I could see," he explained as he showed her the desk. "But since then, it's been challenging to keep everything properly arranged." Eleanor quickly discovered that while the ranch was prosperous, the bookkeeping was indeed in disarray. Bills, receipts, and contracts were haphazardly filed with no consistent system. She set to work creating order, designing a method that would be intuitive for someone relying on memory and touch rather than sight. By mid-afternoon, she had made significant progress. Jackson returned from his morning duties to find her surrounded by neatly organized stacks of papers. "I've created separate folders for different categories of documents," she explained. "Each has a distinctive texture on the spine so you can identify them by touch. I've also started a ledger system where each transaction is recorded in a specific order so information can be read to you more efficiently." Jackson ran his fingers over the embossed leather of the new folders she had fashioned from materials Mrs. Finch had provided. A smile of genuine appreciation spread across his face. "This is incredibly thoughtful," he said. "No one has ever considered how to adapt these systems specifically for me." Eleanor felt a flush of pleasure at his praise. "It's just practical," she said, "but I'm glad you approve." "More than approve," he replied. "This is exactly the kind of partnership I hoped for." The word partnership hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. On the third day of Eleanor's stay, a visitor arrived at the ranch. From her position on the porch where she had been enjoying the morning sun, Eleanor watched a sleek buggy approach, driven by a well-dressed man, accompanied by a fashionably attired woman. Mrs. Finch appeared at the door behind her. "That'll be the Montgomerys," she said with a slight grimace. "Gerald Montgomery owns the bank in Blackwater. His wife, Vivian, considers herself the arbiter of local society." Her tone made it clear this was not a compliment. Eleanor instinctively touched her scar, a habit she had been trying to break. The housekeeper noticed the gesture and patted her shoulder reassuringly. "Head high, Miss Blackwood. You've nothing to be ashamed of." The buggy pulled up and the couple descended. Gerald Montgomery was a portly man with a carefully waxed mustache and an air of self-importance. His wife, a thin woman with sharp features, surveyed the ranch with obvious disdain before her gaze landed on Eleanor. The flicker of shock and distaste that crossed her face was familiar to Eleanor, though the woman quickly masked it with a brittle smile. "You must be the mail-order bride we've heard about," Vivian said without preamble, looking Eleanor up and down. "My word does travel fast in these parts." "Eleanor Blackwood," Eleanor replied evenly, extending her hand. "I'm Mr. Taylor's guest." "Vivian's?" Handshake was limp and brief. "Vivian Montgomery. My husband handles all of Jackson's banking affairs." She glanced toward the doorway. "Is he at home?" Before Eleanor could respond, Jackson appeared behind her. "Montgomery," he greeted, his voice cooler than Eleanor had heard it before. "What brings you out to double tea? Our usual business meeting isn't for another 3 weeks." Gerald cleared his throat. "Just a social call, Taylor. Vivian was curious about your guest." The slight pause spoke volumes. "Miss Blackwood is considering becoming my wife," Jackson said bluntly. "But I don't recall inviting scrutiny of my personal affairs." Vivian's eyes widened at his directness. "We meant no offense," she said quickly. "As your friends, we're naturally concerned about your well-being." Jackson's expression remained impassive. "My well-being has never been better." His hand found Eleanor's elbow with unerring accuracy. "Eleanor, would you be so kind as to ask Mrs. Finch to bring refreshments to the parlor? It seems we have guests to entertain, however unexpected." The pointed comment was not lost on the Montgomerys, who exchanged uncomfortable glances as Eleanor excused herself. In the kitchen, Mrs. Finch was already preparing a tray. "Busybodies," she muttered. "Been trying to get their claws into Mr. Taylor's affairs since his wife passed. Mrs. Montgomery has a niece. She's been pushing at him for 2 years." "I see," Eleanor said, understanding the undercurrent of tension she had sensed. When Eleanor returned to the parlor with Mrs. Finch and the refreshments, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Jackson sat rigidly in his armchair, while the Montgomerys, perched on the edge of the settee, Vivian's eyes darting critically around the room, as if taking inventory. "Ah, tea," Gerald Montgomery said with forced joviality as Mrs. Finch set down the tray. "Excellent." Eleanor took her place beside Jackson, keenly aware of Vivian's scrutinizing gaze lingering on her scar. "So, Miss Blackwood," Vivian began, as Eleanor poured the tea, "I understand you're from Boston. What brings you all the way to Montana? Family troubles, perhaps?" The implication was clear. Only desperation would drive a woman to answer a mail-order bride advertisement. "On the contrary," Eleanor replied evenly, "I came seeking an opportunity, Mrs. Montgomery. The same reason many people venture west." "How admirable," Vivian said, her tone suggesting the opposite. "And your condition, was that from birth?" Jackson's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "I wasn't aware physical appearances were considered appropriate topics for afternoon conversation, Vivian." Gerald cleared his throat uncomfortably. "My wife means no offense, Taylor. Natural curiosity, you understand." "I understand a great deal," Jackson replied coolly, "including when guests overstep." Eleanor placed a calming hand on Jackson's arm. "It's all right," she said softly before addressing Vivian directly. "My scar is from a fire when I was 16. I was trapped in our farmhouse when it caught ablaze. My father pulled me out, but not before the damage was done." She held Vivian's gaze steadily, refusing to show shame or discomfort. The older woman had the grace to look momentarily abashed. "How fortunate that you survived," Gerald offered awkwardly. "Indeed," Eleanor agreed. "Each day since has been a gift, even with its challenges." She smoothly changed the subject. "Mr. Montgomery, Jackson tells me you've been handling the ranch's banking needs for many years." The conversation shifted to safer territory: cattle prices, weather predictions, and local gossip. Throughout, Eleanor noticed how Vivian continued to study her, calculating something behind her tight smile. As the visit drew to a close, Vivian made one final attempt. "We're hosting a small gathering at our home this Saturday evening. Nothing elaborate, just a few of Blackwater's leading families. You simply must attend, Jackson." Her eyes flicked to Eleanor. "Both of you, of course." Jackson's expression remained neutral. "We'll consider it." At the door, as the Montgomerys prepared to leave, Vivian took Eleanor aside while Jackson and Gerald discussed business on the porch. "A word of advice, Miss Blackwood," Vivian said quietly, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Jackson Taylor is one of Montana's most eligible bachelors, blind or not. Many families have daughters who would be more suitable matches." Eleanor met the woman's gaze unflinchingly. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Montgomery, but I believe Jackson is quite capable of determining suitability for himself." Vivian's smile tightened. "Men can be blinded by more than physical afflictions, my dear. Jackson's isolation has made him vulnerable to Certain types of women. What exactly are you implying? Only that a man of his wealth and position must be cautious, Vivian replied, particularly when dealing with someone whose options appear limited. Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. Oh, how fortunate, then, that Jackson values substance over appearance, in friends as well as potential wives. Vivian's eyes narrowed at the subtle barb. Before she could respond, Jackson called from the porch. "Eleanor? Is everything all right?" "Perfectly. Fine," Eleanor replied, her eyes still locked with Vivian's. Mrs. Montgomery was just sharing some local wisdom. After the Montgomerys' departure, Eleanor found Jackson in his study, his fingers drumming irritably on his desk. "I apologize for subjecting you to that," he said as she entered. "The Montgomerys are necessary business connections, but Vivian has been trying to match me with her niece Amanda for years." "So I gathered," Eleanor replied, settling into a chair across from him. "Mrs. Finch mentioned it." Jackson sighed. "Vivian sees herself as Blackwater's social gatekeeper. Having a blind widower with the territory's largest ranch finally remarry would be quite a feather in her cap if she orchestrated the match." "And now I've spoiled her plans," Eleanor observed. A smile tugged at Jackson's lips. "Spectacularly." His expression grew more serious. "What did she say to you at the door?" Eleanor hesitated, then decided on honesty. "She implied I was taking advantage of your blindness and isolation to secure a wealthy husband, despite my limitations." Jackson's jaw tightened. That woman's venom knows no bounds. "It's nothing I haven't heard before," Eleanor assured him, "though usually people are less direct about it." "And yet it still cuts," Jackson said softly. Eleanor was silent for a moment, surprised by his perception. "Yes," she admitted finally, "it does." Jackson reached across the desk, his hand open, palm up. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor placed her hand in his. "Their opinions are worthless," he said firmly. "The question that matters is simple. In the days you've been here, have you found anything that would make you consider staying? Not just as my wife on paper, but as my true partner." The directness of the question took Eleanor's breath away. She looked at their joined hands, considering all she had experienced since arriving at Double T. The ranch's beauty, the respect she'd been shown, the way Jackson treated her as an equal rather than damaged goods. "Yes," she said quietly, "I have." His fingers tightened around hers. "Then let's attend the Montgomerys' gathering on Saturday. Together." "Are you sure that's wise?" A determined smile crossed his face. "Probably not, but I'm tired of Vivian Montgomery and her ilk thinking they can dictate my choices. Besides," he added, his tone lightening, "I'd like to dance with the most beautiful woman in the room." Eleanor laughed despite herself. "You can't even see me." "I don't need to," Jackson replied simply. "Beauty radiates in ways sight can't capture." Saturday evening arrived with a flurry of activity. Mrs. Finch helped Eleanor prepare, pressing one of Sarah's old dresses that had been carefully preserved. The midnight blue silk had been altered to fit Eleanor's slimmer frame, and Mrs. Finch had cleverly reworked the neckline to complement Eleanor's features. "You look lovely," the housekeeper declared as she fastened the last button. "Mr. Taylor won't be able to see it, of course, but everyone else will eat their hearts out." Eleanor studied her reflection in the mirror. The elegant gown transformed her, emphasizing her slender waist and graceful neck. Her hair, styled in a simple but elegant updo, softened her features. The scar remained visible. No amount of powder could fully disguise it, but somehow, in this moment, it seemed less defining. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," she said sincerely. "For everything," the older woman patted her shoulder. "Just hold your head high tonight. Those society folks bark louder than they bite." Downstairs, Jackson waited in the foyer, striking in a formal black suit. His dark hair was neatly combed, his beard trimmed. Despite his blindness, he had an innate dignity that commanded attention. When Eleanor descended the stairs, his head turned toward the sound of her footsteps. Caleb, who stood nearby ready to drive them to town, let out a low whistle. "Miss Blackwood," he said appreciatively, "you're a vision." Jackson straightened. "Describe her to me, Caleb," he requested softly. Caleb cleared his throat. "Well, sir, she's wearing a midnight blue silk dress that matches the evening sky. Her hair's done up fancy, with a few curls framing her face. She looks like a queen, sir, if you don't mind my saying so." A smile spread across Jackson's face as he extended his hand. "Shall we make an entrance, Eleanor?" The Montgomery residence was the largest home in Blackwater, a two-story brick mansion with white columns flanking the entrance. Carriages lined the circular drive as the town's elite arrived for the gathering. Caleb escorted them to the door, where a servant took their wraps before announcing them to the assembled guests. The buzz of conversation dimmed momentarily as heads turned to observe the new arrivals. Jackson's hand rested lightly at Eleanor's elbow as they moved into the room, his posture confident, despite his inability to see the curious and sometimes hostile glances directed their way. Vivian Montgomery approached, her smile strained as she took in Eleanor's transformation. "Jackson, Miss Blackwood, how delightful that you could join us." Her gaze lingered on Eleanor's gown. "What an interesting choice of attire." "Mrs. Finch tells me Eleanor looks beautiful," Jackson replied smoothly. "I'm inclined to agree, even without the benefit of sight." A flush crept up Vivian's neck. "Yes, well, do mingle. There are many people eager to meet your guest." Throughout the evening, Eleanor stood by Jackson's side as various townspeople approached. Some were genuinely welcoming, while others barely concealed their curiosity about her scar and her relationship with the blind rancher. Jackson navigated the social currents with practiced ease, his hand never straying far from Eleanor's arm or the small of her back. "Jackson Taylor, as I live and breathe," a deep voice boomed as a tall man with a silver-streaked beard approached. "Didn't expect to see you at one of Vivian's tedious affairs." "Judge Wilson," Jackson greeted, his face breaking into a genuine smile as he extended his hand. "How are you, old friend?" "Can't complain," the judge replied, shaking Jackson's hand vigorously before turning curious eyes to Eleanor. "And who might this lovely lady be?" "Eleanor Blackwood," Jackson said, pride evident in his voice. "Eleanor, this is Judge Samuel Wilson, the most honest man in Montana Territory and a dear friend." The judge bowed slightly. "A pleasure, Miss Blackwood. Any friend of Jackson's is a friend of mine." His eyes took in her scar, without a change in his warm expression. "I hope you're finding our little corner of the world to your liking." "Very much so," Eleanor replied, instantly liking the straightforward man. "Good, good," Wilson nodded. "This territory needs more women with backbone. Too many wilting lilies trying to pretend they're still in Boston drawing rooms." He leaned closer. "Don't let Vivian Montgomery's crowd fool you. The real heart of this community is found in the people who work the land and build something lasting." As the judge moved on, the small orchestra in the corner began to play a waltz. Couples drifted toward the center of the room, forming a swirling mass of color and movement. "Would you honor me with a dance?" Jackson asked Eleanor quietly. She hesitated. "Are you sure? I wouldn't want you to fall," he finished with a smile. "I've been dancing since I was a boy, Eleanor. Blindness didn't take that away from me." He led her confidently to the dance floor, his hand firm at her waist as they began to move with the music. To Eleanor's surprise, Jackson was an excellent dancer, guiding her smoothly through the steps without a single misstep. "How?" she couldn't help asking as they twirled past other couples. Dancing is about feeling the music and your partner, he explained, drawing her slightly closer. In some ways, I dance better now than when I could see. No distractions. As they moved together in perfect harmony, Eleanor became aware of the states directed their way. Vivian Montgomery watched from the edge of the room, her expression sour. Nearby, a beautiful young woman, presumably the famous niece, Amanda, observed them with undisguised curiosity. "Everyone's watching us," Eleanor murmured. "Let them," Jackson replied, unconcerned. "Do you know what I see right now, Eleanor?" "What?" His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I see a woman who's faced hardship with grace, who speaks her mind, who's brought light back into my home. The rest is just noise." The simple sincerity of his words made her heart swell. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly seen, not despite her scar, but as a whole person, complex and worthy. As the evening progressed, Eleanor noticed Amanda Montgomery approaching determinedly. The young woman was undeniably beautiful, with golden curls and flawless skin, dressed in an elaborate pink gown that must have cost a small fortune. "Jackson," she greeted sweetly, placing a hand on his arm. "Aunt Vivian said you were here. You've been neglecting your friends terribly these past months." "Amanda," Jackson acknowledged, his tone polite but distant. "Allow me to introduce Eleanor Blackwood. Eleanor, this is Amanda Montgomery." The young woman barely glanced at Eleanor before returning her attention to Jackson. "You simply must save a dance for me," she insisted, "for old time's sake." Before Jackson could respond, Gerald Montgomery appeared at his side. "Taylor, a word in private, business matters." He glanced meaningfully at Eleanor. "Men's talk." Though clearly reluctant, Jackson nodded. "I'll return shortly," he promised Eleanor, allowing Gerald to lead him away. Left alone with Amanda, Eleanor braced herself for hostility. To her surprise, the young woman's expression held more curiosity than malice. "So you're the one," Amanda said, studying Eleanor openly. "The mail-order bride who caught Jackson Taylor's attention where others failed." "I merely answered an advertisement," Eleanor replied carefully. Amanda sipped her champagne. "6 others came before you, you know. None lasted more than a day." A small, rueful smile curved her lips. "Including me." Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. "You were a mail-order bride?" Amanda laughed, the sound like tinkling glass. "Heavens, no. But Aunt Vivian arranged for me to accidentally encounter Jackson repeatedly over the past 2 years. He was unfailingly polite and completely uninterested." She shrugged delicately. "It was rather refreshing, actually. Most men are tediously predictable in their attentions." "I don't understand," Eleanor said slowly. "If you weren't interested in him, why is your aunt so determined to match you?" "Money, position, the Double T Ranch," Amanda listed matter-of-factly. "Uncle Gerald has been salivating over Jackson's holdings for years. A marriage would be the simplest way to eventually bring it all into the family." Eleanor was taken aback by her candor. "And you would have agreed to such a match?" "Perhaps," Amanda admitted. "But Jackson would never have agreed, blind or not. He's too shrewd, too independent." She studied Eleanor with new interest. "Which makes me wonder what's different about you." Before Eleanor could respond, Jackson returned, his expression troubled. "Eleanor, I apologize, but I believe we should depart. Gerald has shared some concerning news about cattle rustlers in the area." Amanda melted away as Jackson took Eleanor's arm. "Of course," Eleanor agreed, noting the tension in his face. "Is everything all right?" "Not here," he murmured. "I'll explain in the carriage." They made their excuses to Vivian, who could barely conceal her satisfaction at their early departure. As Caleb drove them home through the darkness, Jackson finally spoke. "Gerald claims there have been reports of rustlers targeting ranches owned by vulnerable proprietors," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Widows, elderly ranchers, and blind cattle barons." Eleanor guessed. Precisely. Jackson's jaw clenched. He strongly suggested I consider selling before the situation becomes untenable. Mentioned that the bank would be happy to make a fair offer. That sounds suspiciously convenient, Eleanor observed. Indeed. Jackson's hand found hers in the darkness of the carriage. Montgomery has been trying to get his hands on the double T for years. This feels like a new tactic rather than a genuine warning. Eleanor squeezed his fingers. What will you do? Increase security, alert the hands to be vigilant, Jackson replied, and disappoint Gerald Montgomery once again by refusing to be intimidated. He turned toward her, his face half illuminated by moonlight. This changes things, Eleanor. If there is a real threat, the ranch could become dangerous. Understanding his implication, Eleanor straightened her shoulders. I'm not easily frightened, Jackson. A small smile touched his lips. No, you're not. His hand tightened around hers. All the more reason why I need an answer soon. Will you stay at Double T? Will you be my wife? The directness of the question hung in the night air between them. Eleanor looked out at the moonlit landscape rolling past, thinking of all that had happened in the short time since her arrival. The ranch already felt like home in a way no place had since the fire. And Jackson, in less than a week, he had shown her more respect and understanding than she had known in years. Your 2-week trial period isn't over, she reminded him softly. I don't need 2 weeks to know what I want, Jackson replied. But I understand if you need more time. Eleanor turned back to him, studying his strong profile in the moonlight. Ask me again tomorrow, she said. After we've both had time to think clearly, away from the Montgomery's influence. Jackson nodded, accepting her wisdom. Tomorrow, then. As they continued toward home, Eleanor reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. 6 failed matches had led her to believe there was no place for someone like her. Now, against all odds, she had found a man who saw her true worth, a man who, despite his blindness, or perhaps because of it, recognized what others could not. Tomorrow will bring its answer. Tonight, under the vast Montana sky, possibility stretched before her like the endless prairie, wild, unpredictable, and full of promise. Dawn broke over Double T Ranch with streaks of crimson and gold, painting the vast Montana sky. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the distant mountains. She had barely slept, her mind replaying Jackson's question from the carriage ride home. The sound of boots on the wooden steps made her turn. Caleb approached, hat in hand, his expression unusually grave. Miss Blackwood, he greeted with a nod. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, she admitted. Is something wrong? Caleb glanced toward the eastern pasture. 2 of our hands found tracks near the North Creek this morning. Strangers on horseback, moving through our property during the night. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. Rustlers? Can't say for certain, Caleb replied. But it's troubling after what Montgomery mentioned last night. He studied her face. Mr. Taylor's in his study. Thought you should know. Eleanor thanked him and made her way to Jackson's study, finding him seated at his desk, his fingers moving rapidly over a braille document. The set of his shoulders conveyed tension, but his face remained composed as he turned toward the sound of her entrance. Eleanor, he greeted. You've heard then? Caleb told me about the tracks, she confirmed, taking the seat across from him. Do you think it's connected to Gerald Montgomery's warning? Jackson's fingers stilled on the document. It seems too coincidental otherwise. He leaned back in his chair. I've sent riders to our neighboring ranches to inquire if they've experienced similar intrusions. What can I do to help? Eleanor asked without hesitation. A hint of surprise crossed Jackson's face, followed by genuine appreciation. Most women would be packing their trunks at the first sign of trouble. I'm not most women, Eleanor reminded him with a small smile. No, Jackson agreed softly. You're certainly not. He seemed to make a decision. I need to ride out with Caleb to inspect the north boundary. Would you be willing to review the property maps with Timothy? He knows the land, but struggles with reading. Together, you could identify vulnerable points where rustlers might move cattle across our borders. The task was a clear expression of trust, and Eleanor recognized it as such. Of course. I'll start right away. The morning passed in concentrated work. Timothy proved to be knowledgeable about the ranch's terrain despite his youth, and Eleanor's quick mind helped organize their observations into a coherent security plan. By noon, they had identified 3 areas where the ranch's natural boundaries were weakest, marking them on a large map with Braille notations Eleanor created for Jackson's reference. When Jackson returned for the midday meal, his clothes were dusty from the ride, but his face showed relief when Eleanor and Timothy presented their work. This is exceptional, he said, as his fingers traced the Braille markers. You've identified exactly the areas Caleb and I were concerned about. His hand found Eleanor's on the table, squeezing it briefly. Thank you. Will you increase patrols? She asked. Jackson nodded. We're doubling the night riders and setting up additional line camps near those vulnerable points. He hesitated, then added, I've also sent word to Judge Wilson. If this is connected to Montgomery's schemes, Samuel should know. After the meal, Jackson disappeared with Caleb to implement the new security measures. Eleanor found herself restless, wanting to contribute further. She sought out Mrs. Finch, who was inventorying supplies in the kitchen storeroom. There must be something more I can do, Eleanor insisted. The housekeeper regarded her thoughtfully. Ranch hands work harder with full bellies, she observed. If you're serious about helping, we could prepare extra provisions for the men at the line camps. For the next several hours, Eleanor worked alongside Mrs. Finch, baking bread, preparing preserved meats, and packing containers of food that could last for days. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from her swirling thoughts about Jackson's proposal and the potential threat to the ranch. Late afternoon found her delivering the provisions to the bunkhouse, where Timothy helped load them onto pack horses. The young man worked with quiet efficiency, but Eleanor noticed his frequent glances toward the ranch gates. Are you worried? She asked him. Timothy adjusted a saddle strap before answering. Mr. Taylor built something special here, he said. Finally. Gave me a job when no one else would hire a boy who could barely read his own name, treats everyone fair. His young face hardened with determination. We won't let anyone take that from him. His loyalty touched Eleanor deeply. In her short time at Double T, she had witnessed how Jackson inspired such devotion, not through demands or intimidation, but through respect and fairness. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Eleanor returned to the main house, to find Jackson waiting for her on the porch. He stood as she approached, his acute hearing identifying her footsteps. Walk with me, he requested, offering his arm. Eleanor accepted, allowing him to guide her away from the house toward a small rise overlooking the ranch. The setting sun bathed everything in golden light, transforming the landscape into a painting of amber and shadow. Beautiful evening, Jackson commented as they reached the top of the rise. It is, Eleanor agreed, then added impulsively, the sun is setting behind the mountains, painting them gold and purple. The ranch buildings look warm and solid in the light, and I can see riders moving cattle in the south pasture. Jackson smiled, appreciating her description. I used to come here often after I lost my sight, he confessed. I'd try to remember exactly how everything looked at different times of day, different seasons. Eventually, I realized I was clinging to something I couldn't have back, instead of embracing what remained. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Jackson turned to face her. "I asked you a question last night," he said quietly. "I promise to ask again today, when we were clear-headed and away from outside influences." Eleanor's heart quickened. "I remember." "Before I do," Jackson continued, "I want you to know something. The threat to the ranch doesn't change my reasons for asking, whether Montgomery is plotting against me or not, whether rustlers threaten my cattle or not. My question comes from what I've discovered about you, Eleanor Blackwood." He took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "In 1 week, you've brought more clarity and purpose to Double T than I've known in years. You've organized my accounts, created systems I can actually use, stood your ground against the Montgomerys, and today helped secure my ranch. You've done all this without complaint, without seeking praise, and without once treating my blindness as a burden or limitation." Jackson's unseeing eyes seemed to find hers unerringly. "I don't need more time to know that I want you as my wife. Not just on paper, not just as a business arrangement, but as my true partner in every sense. I believe we could build something remarkable together." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small gold ring with a modest diamond. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right woman to wear it." He held it out. "Eleanor Blackwood, will you marry me?" The simple, heartfelt proposal brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She looked at the man before her, strong, capable, kind, and at the ring gleaming in the last rays of sunset. 6 times she had journeyed west seeking connection, only to be rejected for her scarred appearance. Now this man who couldn't see her face had somehow seen directly into her heart. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Jackson, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he carefully slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if meant for her all along. Without hesitation, Jackson drew her into an embrace, his lips finding hers in a tender first kiss that spoke of promise and possibility. When they finally parted, Eleanor rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Well," Jackson said, his voice warm with happiness, "I believe the traditional next step is a wedding." Eleanor laughed. "How soon?" "As soon as possible," he replied without hesitation. "Unless you'd prefer a long engagement." She thought of the uncertain threats facing the ranch, of the 6 failed journeys that had led her here, of the immediate sense of belonging she'd felt at Double T. "No," she decided, "as soon as possible sounds perfect." They walked back to the ranch house, hand in hand, the darkening sky above them filling with stars. Mrs. Finch took one look at them and broke into a wide smile, clapping her hands together in delight when Eleanor showed her the ring. "About time," the housekeeper declared, wiping a suspicious moisture from her eyes. "I'll start planning the wedding supper immediately." "Nothing elaborate," Jackson cautioned, though his smile belied his stern tone. "Just our ranch family." "And Judge Wilson," Eleanor added. "I'd like him to perform the ceremony if he's willing." Jackson squeezed her hand. He'd be honored. Over supper they discussed plans for a simple ceremony at the ranch in 3 days' time. Word would be sent to Judge Wilson in the morning, and Mrs. Finch would handle the necessary preparations with her usual efficiency. "What about your family in Philadelphia?" Jackson asked, as they lingered over coffee in the library afterward. "Would you like to send them?" Eleanor hesitated. Though she'd maintained correspondence with her parents and brother, their relationships had grown distant after the fire. Her disfigurement had been a source of discomfort for them, a visible reminder of a tragedy they preferred to forget. "No," she said finally, "my family made their peace with my departure. This new beginning is ours alone." Jackson seemed to understand the weight behind her words, not pressing further. Instead, he turned the conversation to practical matters, where she would like her personal study to be located, changes she might wish to make to the house, her thoughts on expanding the ranch's operations. "You truly mean for this to be a partnership?" Eleanor observed, touched by his consideration. "In every way," Jackson confirmed. "Double T will be as much yours as mine." The next morning, Eleanor woke to unusual sounds from the ranch yard. Peering from her window, she saw a group of riders approaching the main house, led by Judge Wilson. His early arrival was unexpected, but more concerning was his grim expression as he dismounted. Eleanor dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, finding Jackson already in conversation with the judge in his study. Both men looked up as she entered. "Eleanor!" Jackson greeted, extending his hand toward her. "Samuel has brought troubling news." Judge Wilson nodded a greeting. "Miss Blackwood, I wish my visit came under happier circumstances." "What's happened?" Eleanor asked, moving to Jackson's side. "The Parker's ranch 10 miles west was hit by rustlers last night," the judge explained. "They took nearly 30 head of cattle and burned a barn when old Parker tried to stop them." Jackson's hand tightened around Eleanor's. "Was anyone hurt?" "Parker took a beating, but will recover," Wilson replied. His description of the rustlers was interesting. One of them mentioned something about clearing out the weak ranchers for progress. Same language Gerald Montgomery uses in town council meetings. "That doesn't necessarily mean Montgomery is involved," Eleanor pointed out, though suspicion gnawed at her. "True," Wilson acknowledged, "but I received information this morning that Montgomery's bank has suddenly called in loans from 3 smaller ranches in the area, all places that have reported strange riders or missing cattle in the past month." Jackson's expression darkened. "A pattern emerges. I've deputized some men to help patrol the area," Wilson continued, "but I wanted to warn you personally. If Montgomery is behind this, and I'd stake my reputation that he is, Double T would be his ultimate prize." "We've increased security," Jackson assured him, "but I appreciate the warning." He paused. "Since you're here, Samuel, there's another matter we hope to discuss with you. Eleanor has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage. We'd be grateful if you would perform the ceremony." Despite the serious circumstances, Wilson's face broke into a genuine smile. "Well, that's the best news I've heard in months. Of course I'll officiate." He took Eleanor's hand warmly. "Congratulations, my dear. Jackson's a lucky man." "We'd planned on 3 days from now," Eleanor explained. "A small ceremony here at the ranch." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "Given the current situation, that timing might be providential. A wedding would provide good cover for extra men around the property without alerting potential troublemakers." The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Judge Wilson dispatched riders to notify neighboring ranches of the potential threat and to coordinate increased patrols of the area. Eleanor worked with Mrs. Finch to prepare for both the wedding and the possibility of housing additional men if needed. By evening, Double T had transformed into a state of alert readiness disguised as wedding preparations. 4 trusted hands from neighboring friendly ranches had arrived to help with the celebration, their rifles carefully stored in the bunkhouse. Eleanor found Jackson in the stables just after sunset, checking on midnight before retiring for the evening. She watched silently for a moment as his hands moved confidently over the horse's flanks, murmuring reassurances to the animal. "I'm sorry our wedding has become entangled with ranch security," Jackson said without turning, somehow aware of her presence. "Don't be," Eleanor replied, stepping forward to stroke Midnight's velvety nose. "I prefer knowing what we're facing rather than pretending all is well." Jackson's hand found hers on the horse's neck. "Most brides wouldn't be so understanding about having armed guards at their wedding. I think we've established I'm not most brides," Eleanor returned with a wry smile. "Besides, I prefer to think of it as having extremely attentive wedding guests." Her attempt at humor earned a chuckle from Jackson. "How are you managing all of this?" he asked more seriously. "It's hardly the peaceful transition we might have hoped for." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "When I left Boston," she said finally, "I had nothing left to lose. 6 rejections had convinced me I was destined for a life alone. Finding Double T, finding you, has given me something worth fighting for. If that fight begins sooner rather than later, so be it." Jackson drew her into his arms, holding her close. "You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor Blackwood. Soon to be Eleanor Taylor," she reminded him softly. "Indeed." His arms tightened around her. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Later that night, Eleanor sat at her bedroom window looking out over the moonlit ranch. Armed riders patrolled the perimeter, their silhouettes occasionally visible against the silver-washed landscape. In just 1 week, this place had become home, and these people her family. The threat of loss loomed large, but so did her determination to protect what she had found. Eleanor's fingers traced the familiar path of her scar, no longer with shame, but with a sense of strength. The fire that had marked her had also forged her, creating the woman who now prepared to stand alongside a blind rancher against those who would take what was theirs. Her 6 rejections had led her here, to the one man who saw beyond appearances to the heart of things. Tomorrow would bring either a wedding or a confrontation, perhaps both. But for the first time in years, Eleanor faced the future without fear, secure in the knowledge that whatever came, she would no longer face it alone. As if sensing her thoughts, a soft knock sounded at her door. Mrs. Finch entered, carrying a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "This arrived for you today," the housekeeper explained. "A wedding gift from Judge Wilson's wife." Eleanor unwrapped the package to find a delicate lace handkerchief and a note. "For the bride, something new. To carry as you begin, something beautiful. May you and Jackson find joy in each other, even in troubled times. Margaret Wilson." "That was thoughtful of her," Eleanor said, running her fingers over the intricate lacework. Mrs. Finch nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Miss Blackwood, Eleanor, I want you to know that I've served at Double T for 15 years. I was here when Mr. Taylor lost his sight, when he lost his first wife. I've never seen him as alive as he's been since you arrived." The simple statement brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch." The housekeeper patted her hand. "Get some rest, dear. Tomorrow will be a significant day, one way or another." After Mrs. Finch departed, Eleanor returned to the window, the lace handkerchief still clutched in her hand. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of lanterns at the line camps, Double T's defenders keeping watch in the night. "Something new," she whispered to herself, thinking of the handkerchief, of Jackson's ring on her finger, of the life they would build together. Outside, a cloud passed over the moon, momentarily plunging the landscape into darkness. When it emerged, again, Eleanor noticed movement at the edge of the property, too far to identify clearly, but enough to raise her hackles. Shadows moving where they shouldn't be, strangers approaching in the night. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and hurried downstairs, her heart pounding against her ribs. In the main hall, she nearly collided with Caleb, who was pulling on his coat. "Miss Blackwood," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "You should be resting." "I saw movement along the western boundary," she explained breathlessly. "Shadows moving through the trees." Caleb's expression hardened. "I was just alerted to the same. Timothy spotted riders approaching from the south as well." He reached for his hat. "Mr. Taylor is in his study with Judge Wilson. They should be informed immediately." Eleanor nodded, heading toward the study, while Caleb disappeared through the front door. She found Jackson and the judge bent over maps of the ranch, their faces grave in the lamplight. "Eleanor?" Jackson turned at the sound of her entrance. "What's wrong?" Riders approaching from the west, she reported. Caleb says Timothy spotted others from the south. Judge Wilson's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. It seems Montgomery's men have decided to make their move. Jackson stood, his posture alert but calm. Samuel, alert the men. Eleanor, find Mrs. Finch and have her prepare the root cellar. If there's gunfire, that's where the household staff should take shelter. And where will you be? Eleanor asked, already knowing the answer. Defending what's mine, Jackson replied simply. Eleanor stepped forward, placing her hand on his arm. What's ours? She corrected firmly. I'm not hiding in a cellar while our home is threatened. Something like pride flickered across Jackson's face. Eleanor, I grew up on a farm, she interrupted. I can handle a rifle. Judge Wilson gave a short laugh. She's a perfect match for you, Taylor. He tipped his hat to Eleanor. I'll gather the men. You two decide where you'll be most useful. After the judge departed, Jackson pulled Eleanor close. I won't risk losing you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Nor I you, she replied steadily. Which is why we stand together. For a moment, he seemed about to argue further, but then his expression softened. Very well. But you stay at the house with Mrs. Finch. The windows provide good vantage points, and it's more defensible than being in the open. Eleanor nodded, accepting the compromise. What's our plan? We outnumber them with the additional hands, Judge. Wilson brought, Jackson explained, but we need to understand their intentions before acting. If they're just here to steal cattle, we'll defend the herds. If they've come for more... He left the sentence unfinished. For us, Eleanor completed the thought. For Double T itself. Yes. Jackson's fingers brushed her cheek gently. Either way, we're prepared. The next hour passed in tense preparation. Mrs. Finch armed herself with a shotgun she handled with surprising familiarity, explaining simply, 15 years on the frontier teaches a woman a few things. Timothy and 2 other young ranch hands were positioned upstairs with rifles, while Eleanor took a position at a ground-floor window, the weight of a carbine, unfamiliar but not unwelcome, in her hands. Jackson, despite Eleanor's protests, joined. Caleb and the judge outside, his intimate knowledge of the ranch layout, making him an essential part of their defense strategy. I may be blind, he told her firmly, but I'm not helpless. The moon disappeared behind clouds again, plunging the ranch yard into darkness, broken only by a few distant lanterns. Eleanor strained her eyes against the gloom, suddenly understanding how Jackson must feel all the time, aware of dangers he couldn't see, relying on other senses to navigate the world. A low whistle from outside, their prearranged signal, indicated riders approaching openly now. Eleanor could make out a group of perhaps 8 men, emerging from the trees, moving slowly toward the main house. They're not trying to hide anymore, Mrs. Finch observed from her position at another window. That's either very good or very bad. The lead rider raised his hand, and the group halted about 50 yards from the house. In the dim light, Eleanor could just make out Gerald Montgomery's portly silhouette, astride a large horse. Beside him rode a leaner figure she didn't recognize. Taylor, Montgomery called out, I know you're there. Let's talk like civilized men. From the shadow of the barn, Jackson emerged with Judge Wilson at his side, both men moving with deliberate confidence. Caleb and 2 other ranch hands flanked them, rifles ready, but not aimed directly at the visitors. This is private property, Montgomery, Jackson called back, his voice steady. State your business or leave. Gerald Montgomery shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Now, Taylor, there's no need for hostility. I've brought Mr. Harrington from the Territorial Land Office. There are some irregularities with your deed that need discussing. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Land deed challenges were a common tactic used to force smaller ranchers off their property. Without valid documentation, even established ranches could be declared open territory. My deed is properly registered with both the county and territorial offices, Jackson replied. As Judge Wilson can attest, the judge stepped forward. I certified those documents myself, Harrington. What exactly are these supposed irregularities? The lean man beside Montgomery cleared his throat. New survey. Lines indicate the original boundary markers were misplaced. According to our calculations, nearly half of what Taylor claims actually falls outside his legal purchase. A murmur ran through the ranch hands gathered in the shadows. To lose half of Double T would cripple the operation beyond recovery. That's convenient timing, Jackson observed, his tone deceptively mild. Especially given your recent offer to buy my property, Montgomery. Gerald's face tightened visibly even in the dim light. This isn't personal, Taylor. It's progress. The territory's changing. Modern operations, proper financing, that's the future. Men like you, with your limitations, can't keep up. Eleanor's fingers tightened on her rifle. The casual cruelty of the statement made her blood boil. Strange, Jackson replied evenly, how these survey errors only affect ranches that have refused to sell to your bank. Montgomery's composure slipped. Don't be difficult, Taylor. You're outnumbered. Be reasonable, and we can work out fair compensation for the portions you'll lose. Am I outnumbered? Jackson gestured casually, and suddenly lanterns blazed to life around the perimeter of the ranch yard, revealing over a dozen armed men positioned strategically around the property. It seems your information is outdated, Gerald. The banker's face paled as he realized the trap he'd ridden into. Judge Wilson stepped forward, his voice carrying clear authority. Gerald Montgomery, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, intimidation, and suspected involvement in cattle rustling. This is outrageous, Montgomery sputtered. Harrington, tell him the survey is legitimate. The land office representative looked distinctly uncomfortable. Mr. Montgomery suggested there might be inconsistencies worth examining. I haven't actually verified. Enough, Montgomery snapped. He turned to the men who had accompanied him. What are you waiting for? We came here for a purpose. One of the riders raised his rifle, but before he could aim, a shot rang out from the upstairs window of the ranch house. The man cried out, dropping his weapon as he clutched his shoulder. That was a warning, Timothy's young voice called from above. The next one won't be. Chaos erupted as Montgomery's men reached for their weapons, but they found themselves caught in crossfire from all directions. 2 more were wounded before their leader raised his hands in surrender. Hold fire, Judge Wilson commanded. Montgomery, order your men to disarm immediately. The banker, his face now ashen, nodded jerkily. Do as he says, he told his companions. Drop your weapons. Eleanor watched in stunned silence as the men complied, dismounting under the watchful eyes of the ranch hands. Judge Wilson and Caleb moved efficiently to disarm and bind them, while Jackson stood impassively at the center of the action, somehow projecting authority despite his blindness. Search them thoroughly, the judge instructed. Montgomery's not one to play fair. The warning proved prescient. As one of the ranch hands approached Gerald, the banker suddenly produced a small derringer from his sleeve, swinging it toward Jackson. This is your fault, Taylor, he snarled. You and your scarred mail-order bride. Eleanor didn't think, she acted. The rifle in her hands barked, the recoil slamming into her shoulder as Gerald Montgomery pitched sideways from his horse, the derringer discharging harmlessly into the ground. She had aimed for his arm, but in the chaos couldn't be certain where her bullet had struck. Silence fell over the ranch yard as all eyes turned toward the house. Eleanor stood frozen at the window, the smoking rifle still clutched in her trembling hands. Jackson's voice cut through the silence. Eleanor, I'm here, she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. Is he wounded, not dead? Judge Wilson confirmed, kneeling beside the fallen banker. Clean shot through the shoulder. Good aim, Mrs. Taylor. Mrs. Taylor. The name startled Eleanor almost as much as the fact that she had just shot a man. She lowered the rifle slowly, meeting Mrs. Finch's wide-eyed gaze. Well, the housekeeper said finally. "That's certainly one way to start a marriage." Outside, order was gradually restored. The wounded were treated, the prisoners secured. Judge Wilson dispatched 2 riders to Blackwater to bring back additional deputies and the town doctor. By dawn, the immediate crisis had passed, and the ranch yard was quiet once more, though now populated with exhausted defenders catching what rest they could before full daylight. Eleanor found Jackson on the porch, his face turned toward the lightening eastern sky. Without a word, she moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing against his arm. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" she countered. "It was your ranch they came to take." "Our ranch," he corrected, echoing her earlier statement. "And I meant about the shooting. Taking aim at another human being, even in defense, isn't something that leaves one unaffected." Eleanor considered his question carefully. "I'm shaken," she admitted, "but not regretful. He meant to harm you." Jackson's arm slipped around her, waist drawing her closer. "Judge Wilson says your quick action likely saved my life. The man you wounded confessed that Montgomery planned to kill me and blamed it on a stray shot from the confusion." A shudder ran through Eleanor at how close they had come to disaster. "What happens now?" "Montgomery will face charges for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder," Jackson explained. "His accomplices have already started talking, hoping for leniency. It seems they were responsible for the rustling at neighboring ranches, creating financial distress that forced sales to Montgomery's bank. And the land claim? Already dismissed. Harrington admitted he was pressured to challenge our deed without any legitimate basis." Jackson's arm tightened around her. "Double T remains intact, and ours." Eleanor leaned into his embrace, watching as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the distant mountains. "Not quite the wedding eve I imagined," she said with a tired smile. Jackson laughed softly. "No, I suppose not." He turned to face her, his expression growing serious. "We could postpone, if you prefer, after such an ordeal." "Absolutely not," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "I've waited long enough to become your wife, Jackson Taylor. I won't let Gerald Montgomery delay us a single day more." The joy that spread across his face was like the dawn breaking. "In that case," he said, "I believe we have preparations to complete." Despite the eventful night, the ranch transformed throughout the day. Judge Wilson's deputies arrived to take charge of Montgomery, and his men removing them to the Blackwater jail. The county doctor treated the wounded, declaring none of the injuries life-threatening, and through it all, Mrs. Finch orchestrated wedding preparations with remarkable efficiency, declaring that a little attempted robbery and gunplay was no reason to disrupt her schedule. By late afternoon, the ranch yard had been swept clean of any evidence of the previous night's confrontation. Lanterns hung from the porch railings, tables were arranged beneath the large oak tree, and wildflowers gathered by the younger ranch hands decorated every available surface. In the guest room that had been hers for the past week, Eleanor sat before the mirror as Mrs. Finch arranged her hair. The housekeeper had produced a simple but elegant white dress that had belonged to her own daughter, altering it skillfully to fit Eleanor's slender frame. "There," Mrs. Finch said with satisfaction, placing a crown of wildflowers atop Eleanor's. "Dark curls. Perfect." Eleanor studied her reflection. The scar remained, of course. It always would. But somehow, it seemed less prominent today, overshadowed by the radiance in her eyes and the genuine smile that curved her lips. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Mrs. Finch squeezed her shoulder. "You brought life back to this house, Miss Blackwood, and to him." She stepped back, wiping a suspicious moisture from her eyes. "Now, are you ready to become Mrs. Taylor?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Outside, The ranch hands and neighboring families had gathered beneath the oak tree. Judge Wilson stood ready, his judicial demeanor softened by the genuine smile he wore. Caleb and Timothy, scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday best, looked almost unrecognizable. And Jackson waited at the center of it all, tall and handsome in a black suit, his unseeing eyes turned expectantly toward the house. As Eleanor emerged onto the porch, a hush fell over the assembled guests. She walked slowly toward him, savoring each step of this journey, not just across the ranch yard, but the longer path that had brought her here. 6 rejections, countless tears, years of loneliness, all leading to this moment, this man, this place that had become home. When she reached Jackson's side, his hand found hers unerringly, as if drawn by invisible threads that connected them. "Onto each other, you're here," he murmured. "Where else would I be?" she replied softly. Judge Wilson cleared his throat, beginning the ceremony with well-worn words that took on new meaning for Eleanor as she stood beside the man who had seen past. Her scars to the woman beneath. "Do you, Jackson Taylor, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Jackson's voice rang clear and sure. "I do." "And do you, Eleanor Blackwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eleanor looked up at Jackson's face, at the strength and kindness written there, at the future they would build together. "I do," she answered, her heart in her voice. "Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Wilson beamed at them. "You may kiss your bride, Taylor." Jackson's hands framed her face, with gentle precision, his fingers brushing lightly over her features before he bent to claim her lips in a kiss that sealed their union. Applause and cheers erupted around them, but Eleanor heard only the words Jackson whispered against her lips. "My beautiful wife." As the celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing beneath the stars, Eleanor found herself momentarily alone on the porch, watching as Jackson conversed with Judge Wilson by the bonfire. The flickering light outlined his strong profile, and her heart swelled with a happiness she had once thought forever beyond her reach. "Mrs. Taylor," Caleb greeted, joining her with 2 glasses of cider. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Caleb," she replied, accepting the offered drink. "And thank you for all you did to protect Double T." The foreman shrugged modestly. "Just doing my job." He nodded toward Jackson. "He gave me a chance when others wouldn't. Seems you understand something about that." Eleanor touched her scar reflectively. "Yes, I suppose I do." "Makes for a strong foundation," Caleb observed. "Knowing someone chose you, not despite your challenges, but seeing the strength those challenges built in you." His simple wisdom struck Eleanor deeply. "You're a philosopher, Mr. Morris," he chuckled, tipping his hat before moving to rejoin the festivities. "Just a man who's seen enough of life to recognize the real thing when it comes along." As the night deepened, Eleanor and Jackson slipped away from the celebration, walking hand in hand toward the small rise where he had proposed. Above them, stars crowded the vast Montana sky, witnesses to the union of 2 souls who had found in each other's wounds the perfect space to heal. "Happy, Mrs. Taylor?" Jackson asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "And you?" His lips found her temple, brushing gently over her scar. "I never thought I'd find someone who could see me as I am, not as the blind rancher to be pitied or feared, but simply as a man. And I never imagined someone would look at me and see beauty rather than disfigurement," Eleanor replied. "We're well matched, you and I." Jackson laughed softly. 6 rejections led you to me. Perhaps fate has a sense of humor after all. Or perhaps, Eleanor suggested, leaning into his embrace, it simply takes time to find the one person who can truly see us. Together they stood beneath the endless sky, 2 scarred souls who had found in each other not just acceptance, but celebration, a blind man who saw with his heart, and a marked woman who had finally found the place where she was most perfectly, beautifully whole. The autumn sun bathed Double T Ranch in golden light as Eleanor Taylor stood on the front porch, watching a small figure on horseback trotting confidently around the corral. At 7 years old, Timothy had grown into a skilled junior ranch hand. His reading improved dramatically under Eleanor's patient tutelage. Now he was teaching someone else. "Sit up straight, Sarah," Timothy called to the little girl on the gentle pony. "Remember what your pa taught you about feeling the horse's movements." 4-year-old Sarah Taylor adjusted her posture, her dark curls bouncing as she gripped the saddle horn with determined little fingers. "Like this, Timothy?" "Perfect," the young man approved. "You're a natural, just like your pa." Eleanor smiled at the comparison. Sarah had indeed inherited her father's affinity for horses, along with his determined spirit and outgoing nature. What she had received from Eleanor, besides her dark hair, was a thoughtful disposition and a love of books. The screen door creaked behind her, and Jackson emerged from the house, moving with the same confident stride that had first impressed Eleanor all those years ago. "How's the riding lesson going?" he asked, his hand finding the small of Eleanor's back with practiced ease. "Sarah's a natural, according to Timothy," Eleanor replied, leaning into his touch. "Though I suspect he's an indulgent teacher." Jackson chuckled. "Everyone on this ranch spoils her rotten, and you know it, including her father," Eleanor teased gently. "Especially her father," Jackson admitted without shame. His expression softened as he listened to their daughter's delighted laughter floating across the yard. "Is she using the saddle I had made for her?" "Yes, it fits her perfectly," Eleanor confirmed. "Caleb says it's the finest child's saddle he's ever seen." In the 5 years since their wedding, Double T Ranch had flourished beyond even Jackson's ambitious expectations. The attempted takeover by Gerald Montgomery, who now served a 10-year prison sentence for his crimes, had ironically strengthened their position in the county. With Montgomery's banking scheme exposed, many smaller ranchers had turned to Jackson for guidance, eventually forming a cooperative that gave them all better leverage with cattle buyers and supply merchants. Eleanor had proven herself an exceptional partner in every sense. Her organizational skills transformed the ranch's bookkeeping and correspondence, while her natural intelligence and quick learning allowed her to master the complexities of cattle breeding and land management. Within 2 years, she was as knowledgeable about ranching as most lifelong cattlemen. But perhaps her most significant contribution had been establishing a small schoolhouse on Double T property, where she taught the children of ranch hands and neighboring families 3 days each week. What had begun as an informal arrangement with 5 students now served 22 children from across the county, fulfilling Eleanor's long-deferred dream of becoming a teacher. "Mama, Papa, watch me!" Sarah called, guiding her pony into a small circle as Timothy looked on proudly. "She's turning counterclockwise," Eleanor narrated softly for Jackson's benefit. "Her posture is perfect, and she's using the reins just as you taught her." Jackson's face glowed with pride. "That's my girl," he called back. "Well done, Sarah." After completing the circle, Timothy helped Sarah dismount and led both her and the pony toward the porch. The little girl ran ahead, her boots clattering on the wooden steps as she threw herself into her father's waiting arms. "Did you see me?" "Papa, I did it all by myself." "I certainly did," Jackson replied, swinging her up effortlessly. "You'll be out pacing midnight before we know it." Sarah giggled, then reached out to touch her father's face, a habit she had developed as a toddler. "Are you proud of me?" "More than you could possibly know," Jackson assured her, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor watched the interaction, her heart full. From the moment Sarah was born, Jackson had been a devoted father, never allowing his blindness to limit his parenting. He had developed his own methods for caring for an infant, relying on touch and sound where sight failed him. And Sarah, from her earliest days, had seemed to understand her father's unique way of experiencing the world. instinctively guiding his hands to show him things and describing what she saw in remarkable detail for such a young child. "Mrs. Taylor," Timothy said, approaching the porch after securing the pony. "Judge Wilson's buggy just turned onto the main road. Should be here in about 10 minutes. "Thank you, Timothy," Eleanor replied. "Would you let Mrs. Finch know? We'll want refreshments ready." As Timothy headed toward the kitchen door, Eleanor turned to Jackson and Sarah. "We should get cleaned, up for the judge's visit. Sarah, remember what we discussed about your new dress?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "It's a special occasion, so I have to keep it clean and be on my very best behavior." "That's right," Eleanor confirmed, taking her daughter's hand. "Let's get you changed." 20 minutes later, the family gathered in the parlor to greet Judge Wilson, who had aged gracefully into his 70s, his hair now completely silver, though his bearing remained as dignified as ever. "There she is," the judge exclaimed as Sarah entered the room in her new blue dress. "The birthday girl herself. Come give your old Uncle Samuel a hug." Sarah ran to embrace him, accepting with delight the wrapped package he presented. "Is this really for me?" "Of course it is," Wilson replied. 4 years old is a very important birthday." "May I open it now, Mama?" Sarah asked, looking to Eleanor for permission. "Yes, but carefully," Eleanor instructed, smiling at their daughter's excitement. Sarah unwrapped the gift with surprising patience, gasping with pleasure at the illustrated book of fairy tales inside. "Oh, thank you, Uncle Samuel. Will you read me a story later?" "I would be honored," the judge promised, winking at Eleanor. "Your mother tells me you're becoming quite the reader yourself." "I can read all my primer books," Sarah announced proudly, "and I help Papa with his letters sometimes." Jackson laughed, reaching out to ruffle his daughter's curls. "She certainly does. Her braille is coming along remarkably well." Eleanor had begun teaching Sarah to read braille alongside standard text as soon as the child showed interest in books. Jackson had initially protested, not wanting his daughter to feel obligated to adapt to his limitations, but Eleanor had gently insisted that it would strengthen their bond. Seeing them now, heads bent together over a braille volume in the evenings, proved the wisdom of her decision. "Well, I have news that might interest you all," Judge Wilson said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Finch. "Gerald Montgomery is being released from prison next month." A momentary tension filled the room. Though the banker's schemes had ultimately failed, the memory of that night and how close they had come to losing everything remained vivid. "Is that wise?" Jackson asked, his expression guarded. "Has he shown any remorse?" The judge sighed. "None whatsoever, but he served his time, and the governor denied our petition to extend his sentence." He sipped his coffee before continuing. "However, you needn't worry about him returning to Blackwater. The terms of his release forbid him from entering the county for 5 years. And his wife divorced him while he was incarcerated, married a sheep rancher from Wyoming, of all things." Vivian Montgomery married a sheep rancher? Eleanor couldn't contain her surprise. The social climbing banker's wife had always been obsessed with status and appearances. "Life has a way of upending our expectations," Wilson observed with a smile, "rather like a scarred schoolteacher and a blind cattle baron building one of the most successful ranches in the territory." The afternoon passed pleasantly with Judge Wilson regaling them with news from town and stories of his early days as a circuit judge. Sarah insisted on showing him her pony before supper, and the judge obliged with grandfatherly patience. After a festive birthday meal, complete with a cake Mrs. Finch had baked specially for the occasion, Sarah was put to bed with a new fairy tale from her book. The adults retired to the library, where Caleb joined them for an after-dinner drink and discussion of ranch business. "The new breeding program is showing promising results," Caleb reported. "Those Hereford bulls Eleanor suggested we introduce have strengthened the bloodlines considerably." Jackson nodded in approval. "And the expansion of the North pasture?" On schedule, Caleb confirmed. We should be able to increase the herd by another 100 heads next spring. As the men discussed cattle and pasture rotation, Eleanor found herself gazing around the library, now transformed from the somewhat austere space she had first encountered. Children's books shared shelves with agricultural journals and classic literature. Sarah's drawings were proudly displayed alongside maps of the ranch. The room, like the rest of the house, had evolved into a true family home. Later, as Judge Wilson prepared to depart, he took Eleanor aside. "We wanted to show you something," he said, withdrawing a newspaper from his coat pocket. "This arrived from Philadelphia last week." Eleanor unfolded the paper, scanning the indicated article. Her breath caught as she read the headline. "Blackwood, farm foreclosed after years of financial struggle. My family's farm," she murmured, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. Though she had maintained sporadic correspondence with her parents, their relationship had remained distant. They had not attended her wedding, nor had they acknowledged Sarah's birth with more than a brief note. "I thought you should know," the judge said gently. "Your brother wrote to me asking if there might be opportunities out west for a man with farming experience. I gathered from his letter that your parents are relocating to your aunt's home in Baltimore." Eleanor refolded the newspaper slowly. "Thank you for telling me. Will you reach out to them?" Wilson asked. She considered the question carefully. "I'll write to my brother," she decided. "Double T could use another experienced hand if he's willing to learn ranching." She glanced toward Jackson, deep in conversation with Caleb. Everyone deserves a second chance to build a meaningful life. After the judge's departure, Eleanor found herself drawn to the small rise overlooking the ranch, the spot where Jackson had proposed, where they had often come to reflect on pivotal moments in their shared journey. The setting sun painted the buildings and pastures in warm hues of gold and amber, the cattle mere silhouettes against the darkening grassland. She heard Jackson's approach before she saw him, his footsteps familiar and sure on the path they had walked countless times together. "You're thinking about your family," he said, coming to stand beside her. Not a question, but a statement born of deep understanding. "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "Judge Wilson brought news of the foreclosure." Jackson was silent for a moment, his face turned toward the setting sun he couldn't see. "Do you regret not maintaining closer ties with them?" "No," Eleanor answered honestly. "They made their choice long ago, when they treated my scar as something shameful rather than simply part of me." She turned to face her husband, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "You taught me the difference between people who look at you and people who truly see you." Jackson caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Will you invite your brother here?" "I'd like to," she said. "If you agree." "Of course." His arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close. "Family is more than blood, Eleanor. It's built through choice and commitment. Your brother is welcome to join ours if that's what you want." They stood together as twilight deepened around them, the first stars appearing in the vast Montana sky. From the main house, a lamp glowed in Sarah's window, Mrs. Finch likely checking on the sleeping child. 5 years, Jackson mused. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday you arrived at Blackwater Station, and sometimes it seems as though you've always been here. "Both can be true," Eleanor suggested, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Some connections exist before we recognize them." Jackson's fingers found the scar on her cheek, tracing its familiar path with tender precision. Over the years, this gesture had evolved from a curiosity to an intimacy, his way of seeing the feature that had once defined her in others' eyes, but had never mattered to him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if those first 6 men hadn't rejected you?" he asked. Eleanor considered the question. "Sometimes, but then I remember that without those rejections, I would never have found my way to Double T, to you, to Sarah, to this life we've built." She turned in his arms to face the ranch spread out below them. I wouldn't trade a single moment of hardship if it meant losing what we have now. Nor would I, Jackson agreed, his voice rich with emotion. My blindness led me to a clearer vision than I ever possessed with sight. As darkness settled fully over the landscape, they made their way back to the house, arm in arm, their steps synchronized after years of walking together. The sounds of home surrounded them, distant cattle lowing, the creak of windmills, the soft murmur of ranch hands in the bunkhouse. Inside, they paused at Sarah's door, opening it quietly to check on their sleeping daughter. The child lay peaceful, among her blankets, one hand curled around the new book of fairy tales, her face innocent in repose. "She doesn't have my scar or your blindness," Eleanor whispered, "but we've given her something more valuable." "What's that?" Jackson asked softly. "The ability to see with her heart," Eleanor replied, "to recognize worth beyond appearances, to understand that love isn't about perfection, but about seeing someone completely and choosing them anyway." Jackson's arm tightened around her waist. "The most valuable legacy we could offer." They closed the door gently and continued to their bedroom, moving through the familiar space with the ease of long habit. As they prepared for sleep, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. From a scarred young woman rejected 6 times to the confident rancher's wife, mother, and teacher she had become. The mail-order bride advertisement that had seemed her last desperate chance had instead been the first step toward everything she had ever truly wanted. And Jackson, the blind cattle baron who had proposed when others had turned away, had given her not just a home, but a life filled with purpose, respect, and deep, abiding love. "What are you thinking?" Jackson asked as they settled into bed together. Eleanor smiled in the darkness. "That sometimes the deepest scars lead us to the greatest healing." She pressed closer to him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her own. And that sometimes being truly seen requires finding someone who looks beyond the surface. "To the heart of things," Jackson murmured, his voice already heavy with approaching sleep. "To the heart," Eleanor agreed, closing her eyes. Outside their window, the vast Montana sky spread its canopy of stars over Double T Ranch, over the cattle sleeping in the pastures, the hands in the bunkhouse, the house filled with memories, both bitter and sweet, and the family who had discovered that true vision transcends sight and true beauty defies scars. In the perfect darkness of their bedroom, a blind man held his scarred wife close, neither one hindered by what the world considered their flaws. Instead, they had built something remarkable on the foundation of those very imperfections, a love that didn't need physical sight to see with perfect clarity, and a life that transformed rejection into the most profound acceptance. For Eleanor Taylor, formerly Eleanor Blackwood, formerly the mail-order bride with a scarred face who was rejected 6 times, the journey had come full circle. She had arrived at Blackwater Station seeking merely a husband who could tolerate her appearance. Instead, she had found a man who celebrated her entirely, scars and all, and in doing so had finally discovered her own true worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.